You're holding back again, aren't you? You'll never reach your potential that way. The words cut through the quiet hum of the gym, igniting a mix of determination and doubt in Dev's chest. He wasn't sure if it was the coach's tone or his piercing gaze that hit him harder, but either way, it made him want to push harder. Dev hadn't always been this uncertain. At 32, he prided himself on being a man of principles. His life with his partner, Neil, was steady, a comfortable rhythm of shared dinners, inside jokes, and long weekends at home. But comfort, as Dev was starting to realize, could sometimes feel like stagnation. That was why he'd signed up for this fitness program in the first place. He wasn't out to reinvent himself, just to feel alive again. When Neil shrugged off the idea of joining him, Dev didn't push. "You go ahead," Neil had said. "I'm happy with my routine." But now, Dev wondered if the cracks had always been there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for something or someone to pull them apart. That someone came in the form of Roman. From the first session, Roman had an energy that filled the room. His confidence was magnetic, his encouragement addictive. At 6 feet tall with a commanding presence, he wasn't just a coach. He was a force. "Stretch further," Roman instructed, his hands guiding Dev's arms as he leaned forward on the mat. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an undertone that felt almost personal. Dev shook the thought away, embarrassed at his own wandering mind. "You've got more in you than this," Roman continued, his tone shifting to one of quiet insistence. "I can see it," Dev exhaled slowly, focusing on the stretch, on the pull in his hamstrings, on anything but the way Roman's fingertips lingered on his shoulders a second longer than necessary. Their sessions began to take on a rhythm. Roman's methods were intense, but they worked. Each week, Dev found himself stronger, more agile, and, perhaps most surprising of all, more eager to show up. There was something about the way Roman believed in him, the way he looked at Dev as if he could conquer the world, that made him feel invincible. At home, Neil noticed the changes. "You're looking good," he'd said one night, his tone casual, distracted. He was scrolling through his phone while Dev stood in the kitchen, sipping water after another grueling session. Dev had waited for more, a follow-up compliment, a spark of interest, but Neil had already moved on to discussing weekend plans. It wasn't that Neil didn't care. Dev knew he did. But somewhere along the line, the passion between them had dulled. Conversations felt transactional, physical affection rare. Neil was predictable in the way that a favorite book might be. You knew what to expect, and while it was comforting, it didn't surprise you anymore. Roman, on the other hand, was nothing if not unpredictable. He had a way of zeroing in on Dev's insecurities without ever making him feel judged. "What are you so afraid of?" Roman had asked one day after noticing Dev hesitate during a particularly difficult drill. Dev had laughed it off, deflecting with a joke, but the question lingered. What was he afraid of? Failing? Letting Neil down? Or was it something deeper, something harder to admit, that he was afraid of wanting more than what he had? The shift happened subtly, a joke that lingered too long, a compliment that felt heavier than it should have. Dev caught himself looking forward to Roman's text, to the sound of his name on Roman's lips. It was innocent, he told himself, harmless. And yet, as the weeks passed, Dev began to notice things he hadn't before. The way Roman's eyes softened when he spoke to him, the way his hand would brush Dev's back, guiding him into position, the way his presence made the room feel smaller, more intimate. One evening, after an especially rigorous session, Roman leaned against the wall as Dev packed up his things. "I think we should schedule some one-on-one time," Roman said, his voice low, deliberate. "You've got potential, Dev. I'd hate to see it go to waste." The words were innocuous enough, but the way Roman said them, calm, unhurried, made Dev pause. For a moment, he couldn't tell if his heart was racing from the workout or something else entirely. He nodded, forcing a smile. Sure, let's do it. As Dev walked out into the crisp night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just crossed an invisible line, one he didn't fully understand yet. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he wanted to turn back. Relax, Dev. Just trust me. Roman's voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it, something softer, almost coaxing. Dev lay on the gym mat, his breath uneven as Roman knelt beside him, adjusting his leg into a deeper stretch. The room was dimmer than usual, the late evening light filtering through the frosted windows. It felt strangely intimate, as though the world outside had dissolved, leaving just the two of them. Dev's mind wrestled with itself. It was just a stretch, he reminded himself, a part of training. Roman was a professional, nothing more. But as Roman's hands gripped his thigh, guiding his movements, Dev couldn't deny the way his pulse quickened. There, Roman murmured, his voice dropping lower. Feel that? Dev nodded, though he wasn't sure if Roman was referring to the stretch or the electricity coursing through the air. His throat was dry, his words caught somewhere between rationality and the unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. The session had started like any other, with Roman's usual blend of encouragement and challenge. But tonight, there was something different in the way Roman looked at him. Something that made Dev feel exposed, as though Roman could see through every excuse, every carefully constructed wall. All right, up, Roman said, standing and offering his hand. Dev took it, his palm warm against Roman's. The contact was brief, but it lingered in Dev's mind as they moved to the next exercise. Roman's focus was sharper than usual, his gaze unwavering. Dev tried to match his intensity, but his mind kept wandering, replaying moments he couldn't explain. The lingering touches, the subtle shifts in tone, the way Roman's attention seemed to linger on him longer than it did on anyone else. Dev, Roman said, snapping him back to the present. You're distracted. What's going on? Nothing. Dev replied too quickly, avoiding Roman's eyes. Roman didn't press, but the silence that followed was heavy, charged. Dev could feel his cheeks flush as he adjusted his stance, trying to focus on the routine. But Roman stepped closer, his presence impossible to ignore. You can be honest with me, you know, Roman said, his voice quieter now. Dev hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He wanted to say something, to diffuse the moment. But before he could, Roman moved behind him to correct his posture. Roman's hand settled on Dev's shoulders, firm but not forceful. Relax, Roman repeated, his breath warm against Dev's neck. You're too tense. Dev froze, his muscles locking as every nerve in his body seemed to fire at once. Roman's hand slid down his arms, guiding them into position, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The sound of weights clinking in the background, the faint hum of the air conditioning, it all faded into nothingness. Better, Roman said, his hands lingering a second too long before stepping back. Dev turned to face him, his heart pounding. He opened his mouth to speak, but Roman's expression stopped him. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something that made Dev feel as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from falling. The rest of the session passed in a blur. Dev went through the motions, his mind spinning with questions he didn't dare ask. By the time they finished, he was exhausted, not from the workout, but from the weight of everything left unsaid. As he packed his bag, Roman leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. You did good tonight, Roman said, his tone lighter now. Thanks, Dev replied, forcing a smile. Roman didn't move, his gaze steady. You know, I see something in you, Dev, something most people overlook. Dev's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Roman stepped closer, his voice dropping. You're different. There's a fire in you, even if you don't see it yet. Dev's breath hitched, his heart racing as Roman's words hung in the air. For a moment, he felt like he was standing in a spotlight, every flaw and insecurity laid bare. Dev started, but Roman cut him off with a small, knowing smile. You don't have to say anything, Roman said, his voice soft. Just think about it. As Dev walked out of the gym, the cool night air hit his face, but it did little to clear his mind. Roman's words echoed in his ears, mingling with the memory of his touch, the intensity in his gaze. He knew he should feel guilty, and part of him did. But there was another part, a quieter, more insistent part, that couldn't stop wondering what might happen if he let himself take one step closer to the edge. You've been quiet lately. Everything okay? Neil's question came unexpectedly over dinner. The clink of his fork against the plate was the only sound in the room as Dev stared at his half-eaten meal. Caught off guard, he looked up, meeting Neil's familiar brown eyes. Steady, dependable, and yet searching. Yeah, just tired, Dev replied, forcing a small smile. Neil nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before returning to his food. Dev felt the weight of his own silence pressing down on him. He wanted to say more, to reach across the distance that had grown between them, but the words felt heavy, tangled in his chest. The truth was, he hadn't been able to stop thinking about Roman. The private session 2 days ago had left him reeling, every moment replaying in his mind like a film he couldn't turn off. The intensity, the connection. It had felt like crossing an invisible line, one he wasn't sure he could step back from. But now, sitting across from Neil, Dev felt a pang of guilt twist in his gut. Neil didn't deserve this. He deserved honesty, transparency. Everything Dev had promised when they built their life together. Later that night, as Neil dozed on the couch, Dev slipped out for a walk. The air was cool and crisp, the streets quiet under the dim glow of streetlights. His mind churned with questions he couldn't answer. Was it just a fleeting moment with Roman, or something deeper? And what did it mean for his relationship with Neil? He pulled out his phone, hesitating before opening his messages. Roman's last text was still there, a simple "great work today" sent after their session. It was neutral on the surface, but Dev couldn't ignore the undertone he'd read into it. He stared at the screen for a long time before typing, "Can we talk?" The response came almost immediately. "Of course. My place or yours." Dev's stomach flipped. He knew what Roman was offering, even if it wasn't explicitly stated. But instead of replying, he locked his phone and shoved it into his pocket. The next day, Dev arrived at the gym earlier than usual. The space was nearly empty, the faint hum of a treadmill the only sound. Roman was already there, leaning casually against the counter, his expression unreadable. "Hey," Roman greeted, his voice warm but cautious. "Hey," Dev replied, his throat dry. Roman gestured toward the mats. "Want to get started?" Dev shook his head, crossing his arms. "Actually, I need to talk." Roman straightened, his easy demeanor shifting. "Okay, what's on your mind?" Dev hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I think I've been misinterpreting this. I don't know." Roman's eyes softened and he stepped closer, keeping his tone calm. "Dev, whatever you're feeling, it's okay to acknowledge it. You don't have to be afraid of what you want." "I'm not afraid," Dev said quickly, though the lie was obvious to them both. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "But I can't do this. I'm with Neil, and whatever this is, it's not fair to him." Roman studied him for a moment before nodding. "I respect that," he said simply, his voice genuine. "But you should know, Dev, it's not just about what's fair to Neil. It's about what's fair to you two." Dev swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He nodded, unable to speak, and turned toward the door. The drive home felt longer than usual, every mile filled with doubt and reflection. When he walked through the door, Neil was waiting, a cup of tea in his hands. "You're home early," Neil said, offering a small smile. "Yeah," Dev replied, his voice quiet. He hesitated, then added, "Neil, can we talk?" Neil set the cup down, his expression curious but open. "Of course. What's going on?" Dev took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I've been feeling disconnected. From us. From myself. And I think I need to be honest about what's been happening." Neil's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He just waited, giving Dev the space he needed. For the first time, Dev let the words come, raw and unfiltered. He didn't tell Neil everything. Some parts felt too fragile to share, but he told enough. Enough to make it clear that they couldn't keep ignoring the cracks in their foundation. When he finished, Neil was quiet for a long time. Finally, he reached out, taking Dev's hand. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "We'll figure this out. Together." In that moment, Dev felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. The road ahead wasn't clear, and the choices he'd made wouldn't be easily undone. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was moving forward, towards something real, something honest.